Trades, more trades. The Falcons are surprisingly active at this year's trade deadline. We'll be breaking down the Ridley trade, Dean Marlowe, as well as what they're getting in Rashad Fenton. And we'll take a deep look at the offensive line and show you some stats to indicate how much growth we've seen from last year to this year with this team's run blocking.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So guys, you know me, I'm Aaron Freeman, your very humble host here of Locked On Falcons, aka Mr. Drew, aka Sirius Black. And of course, I want to thank everyone that makes Locked On Falcons their first listen each and every day. Today's episode is presented by Prize Picks. Prize Picks is daily fantasy made easy. Just pick 2 to 5 players, and if they score more or less than their Prize Picks projection, you can win up to 10 times your money on your entry. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with the promo code Locked On. That's prizepicks.com, promo code Locked On. So as I said, I thank you guys for making Locked On Falcons your first listen. It's of course free and available Monday through Friday on a variety of podcast platforms, including on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On Falcons on YouTube. Give us a like, hit that bell, and you'll get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. So let's talk about the surprisingly active Atlanta Falcons at the trade deadline. They get up to 2 picks in 2023 and 2024 from the Jaguars for Calvin Ridley. They also acquire cornerback Rashad Fenton from the Chiefs for a 7th round pick, a conditional 7th. And they're getting back a 7th from Buffalo by sending them safety Dean Marlowe. We'll circle back to the Fenton and Marlowe trades. Let's talk about Calvin Ridley first. That's the big one. You know, I think this is a great trade for the Falcons. I'll get into some of the reasons why I think that, but it was very surprising to me to see the Falcons trade. It wasn't crazy to me because internally at Locked On, we had a Google Doc that basically allowed the host to list all the players that could be on the trade block. And I remember looking at the Google Doc and thinking, I could put Calvin Ridley on there, but there's almost no chance that some team is going to trade for a guy before he's reinstated in the league. So I just kind of skipped that Google Doc, and then they wind up trading him. So from that perspective, it is a surprise, but it's not like unprecedented. It's just very surprising that a team like Jacksonville was able to pull off the trade. And you get into the sort of convoluted compensation in terms of it. Essentially what Jacksonville is doing right now is they are trading a 2023 6th round draft pick for Calvin Ridley's rights. Right. So they will have the right to Calvin Ridley once he is reinstated in the league, which we assume he will get reinstated next year after the season, but we don't know. And regardless of whether he is reinstated, the Falcons will get that 6th round pick. Now, if he's reinstated by an unspecified date, we don't know what that is. I'm assuming it's, sometime in March or April. The earliest he can be reinstated is February 15th of next year. That 6th round pick in 2023 turns into a 5th round pick in 2023. And then once he's reinstated, then the Falcons, that opens the door for the Falcons to get additional 2024 draft compensation based off of how he performs and what the Jaguars do in 2023. If Calvin Ridley makes the team, which I think, again, assuming he's reinstated, it's a relatively safe assumption, the Falcons will get a 4th round pick in 2024. If Calvin Ridley plays a certain amount, again, unspecified number, that 4th will turn into a 3rd in 2024. If the Jaguars wind up giving Calvin Ridley a new deal after 2023, then that will turn into a 2nd round pick. So we don't know the exact language, the exact specifications, the exact conditions that they have to hit. There was one person that said a long-term deal. Another person said extension. So is that a 1-year deal? Is that a 2-year deal? Whatever. I'm going to assume for until things get cleared up that is if they get him to a 1-year deal. But obviously once things are more specific and cleared up, we will give you those details. But The Falcons have the max potential to get a second in 2024 and a fifth in 2023 for Calvin Ridley. And again, assuming that, nothing crazy happens, nothing goes off the rails with Ridley, as they have done. But he can get back to his grind and become at least a part close to the player that he was prior to stepping away from the game last year. I'm assuming Ridley will start for them. Whether he earns a second contract is up in the air, but I'm assuming that it should be reasonable that it will be at least a third and a fifth, right? They'll get the third because he'll play, and the fifth next year. So I think this is a good deal for the Falcons. I know a lot of people will probably wonder, like, why did the Falcons do this deal now? The first reason is you do get the cap savings sooner versus later. You get those at the very beginning of the offseason rather than after a potential trade for Calvin Ridley, which, the timetable of that, would that get done in February? Would that get done in April or June or whatever? You don't know. So you get those cap savings now, and that you'll be able to spend that come next March. The other reason is you weren't 100% certain that Ridley would get reinstated. And so, whether that was a 1% chance that he wouldn't, whatever, but like getting something for him before that, rather than waiting and hoping that you could then shop him after he's reinstated, it was a little bit up in the air. Again, maybe not huge margins there, and I think getting a conditional second at this point is also why you do the deal. Like the fact that the Jaguars were willing to offer that, I think the Falcons needed to bite on that because I know a lot of people sort of think that the Falcons could get more than a conditional second for Calvin Ridley. I tend to be skeptical, as I am of many things. I know a lot of people look at last year when the rumors were that the Falcons and Eagles were talking about trading him. And then, obviously that deal fell through because Ridley got suspended. And then the Eagles wound up trading a number one to Tennessee for AJ Brown. And a lot of people just assumed, that would have been the Calvin Ridley trade had, he not gotten suspended. He cost us a first round pick. Again, I understand why people make those connections, and it may be true. But again, I'm kind of skeptical of that because the Eagles went around and immediately gave AJ Brown a big time extension, making him like the fifth highest paid wide receiver. And that justified giving up a first round pick. It doesn't justify giving up a first round pick if you weren't willing to do the same with Calvin Ridley. And just based off of his previous year, I don't know if a team, maybe the Eagles were, but I don't know if a team would have been willing to do that. So my assumption, and again, it's an assumption, I don't know, but my assumption was like they were going to get like a second in something. So the fact that they were able to still get a second from Jacksonville instead of, say hypothetically from the Eagles, I think is a win in the Falcons book. And not to mention, I didn't think Calvin Ridley would be on the team next year. If they couldn't trade him, I expected them to cut him. And so again, you can look at that as something for nothing in that regard. So moving forward, obviously I'll be rooting for Calvin Ridley as I have been for many years. While I'm very critical of what I think was a stupid decision of his to break the one rule in the NFL that everybody knows, which is you're not allowed to gamble on football if you play football. I am not at all critical of Calvin Ridley for stepping away from the game for his mental health reasons. And I don't think those two issues are the same as some people like to believe. For me, when I see fans being critical of Calvin Ridley for quote unquote faking his mental health absence and quitting on the team, I will just say, like, your opinions, if that's what you feel the need to comment on below this video, your opinions are not welcome here. And so if you want to be critical of Calvin Ridley for being a dummy for gambling, okay. But if you're going to go all into that stuff and he's quit on the team and he all that stuff, like, get out of here with that nonsense is what I'm going to say. And so, you're more than entitled to having that opinion, but just don't post it in the comments below here is what I would say. And I think sort of the funny thing about that is for all the Falcon fans that have a negative opinion of Calvin Ridley are now compelled potentially to root for him to succeed in Jacksonville because that way the Falcons will get the most trade compensation. They now have to hope that Calvin Ridley's going to ball out in Jacksonville. So for that reason, I love this trade for that reason, because like now Falcon fans, bitter but hurt Falcon fans, have to, basically be like, I hope Calvin Ridley has a monster year in Jacksonville and gets all the money from Jacksonville and looks like the superstar that we want to do, so we can get that second round pick. So we'll see how that all goes out, but we'll continue today's episode getting into the Rashad Fenton and Dean Marlowe trades coming up. But before we get there, guys, I want to tell you about the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family, where you can find 3 shows, 4 hosts, A to Z with Mark Zeno, Hitting Hard with John Chuckery, and ATL Day Ones with Tanisha Batiste and Jarvis Davis, all on the same podcast feed, breaking down the local sports as well as national sports. And of course, you can find Locked On Sports Atlanta available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you subscribe to Locked On Sports Atlanta on YouTube, you will also be able to check out the Locked On Falcons postcast live immediately after the final whistle for every Falcons game this year, where Jarvis and myself are breaking down every win, loss, and or tie for the Falcons this year. So make sure you subscribe to Locked On Sports Atlanta on YouTube, give them a like, hit that bell so that you know when we go live. Now, on to a more serious note, I had a break-in back in 2014, and I had to get a security system, so I got one. And the one I got is the proud sponsor of today's episode, that is Simply Safe. And initially I was attracted to Simply Safe because they were the most affordable option. But what has kept me with Simply Safe for the last 8 years is how much I trust in their service. I love how customizable they are. Whether you need a bare bones security system, they got you covered. If you want all the bells and whistles, you want the HD wireless security cameras, smoke, leak detectors. If you want to know when your pipes are freezing, if you're up north, Simply Safe has you covered. At Simply Safe, your safety is the only thing that matters with their cutting edge technology, powered by 24/7 professional monitoring agents who will always have your back, dispatching police and first responders at the moment of a threat or emergency, even if you're not home or can't be reached. Customize the perfect system for your home in just a few minutes at simplysafe.com/LockedOnNFL. Save 20% on your Simply Safe security system when you sign up for an interactive monitoring plan and get your first month free. Just visit simplysafe.com/LockedOnNFL to learn more. There's no safe like Simply Safe. And guys, I want to thank you again for making Locked On Falcons your first listen. And for your second listen, why not check out Locked On Sports today? From the games that matter to the local expert opinion that only Locked On can provide across all the sports, NBA, NFL, MLB, NHL, college, and more, all available on Locked On Sports today, available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. So let's get into the other trades that broke after 4 p.m. Eastern time, after the trade deadline. The Ridley trade broke about an hour before the trade deadline officially ended. But the Falcons got those last minute moves into the wire. Busy day in trade deadline. 10 trades, I believe, were made on this day, 3 of which from the Falcons. Which was surprising. I thought that number was going to be 0. But let's talk about the other 2 trades. Rashad Fenton, again, a conditional 7th round pick from the Chiefs. And they're getting a 7th round pick back from the Bills, sending them Dean Marlowe. Now, I'm mostly lukewarm on these trades, and that's mostly because I just haven't seen enough of Rashad Fenton to have a strong opinion, good or bad, about it. And over time, as I watch more film, hopefully in the next couple of days, I will have a stronger opinion, thumbs up, thumbs down, or do I remain just mostly lukewarm on it? So we'll circle back to that. But, I think basically the fact that the Falcons are getting a 7th from the Bills and losing a 7 to the Chiefs, probably those picks will be roughly the same. Again, we don't know quite the conditions of those picks. My assumption is the one for Fenton is assuming that he actually plays for the Falcons. They don't cut him in like 3 weeks or something like that. They'll get that pick, but we'll see. But like, if we assume that the Bills and Chiefs are both playing in the AFC Championship game, those picks are going to be like probably like 3 spots away from each other in round 7 at some point. So we'll see how that all plays out. But obviously, the Falcons needed cornerback depth with Fenton, given that it has been challenged in recent weeks and will continue to be challenged moving forward, given the long-term injury to Casey Hayward. We don't know officially if Hayward is out for the season, but it sounds like he is. And the fact that the Falcons made this move only continues to throw fuel on that fire. So, when we get official confirmation if Hayward is out for the season, but I would basically at this point in time, unless we get some update later in the year, I would assume that Hayward will not play for the Falcons moving forward. And obviously AJ Terrell is out for an unknown amount of time. He's quote unquote week to week. I did not expect him to play this weekend, and therefore I also don't expect him to play next week either. So I kind of figured he'd be out for like at least 2 more games. And the reason for that is basically if he doesn't practice by the end of this week, and we'll find out, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday on that. But if he's not at least limited practice, it's very unlikely, given the short turnaround after this upcoming Chargers game on the Thursday night game in week 10 against the Panthers, that they're going to rush him out there for that Panthers game. So if he doesn't practice this week, then he's probably going to be out next week as well. And I don't think Fenton is going to probably play all that much this week. I think there's going to be a little bit of a runway to get him up to speed in this scheme. I know Spags and Peas, as all defenses do, have some overlap, but if he was coming from like, the exact same system, a Peas protege or something like that, then I could understand that maybe they could get him quickly up to speed. So I'm not expecting to see Fenton these next 2 weeks, other than maybe on like special teams or in an emergency type of situation. So it probably means that we'll continue to roll with Darren Hall, Cornell Armstrong, D. Alford, and Isaiah Oliver, some combination of those 4 guys for probably the next 2 or more games, depending on how long it takes Fenton to get up to speed and how long it takes AJ Terrell to get back. Cornell Armstrong is coming off a pretty solid game where he had 3 pass breakups, but he was challenged a ton in man coverage, right? The Falcons ran man coverage 10 times against the Panthers, and 7 of those snaps Armstrong was targeted. Now, he only gave up 2 catches on those 7 targets. Again, 3 of those were broken up by him. The one of those 2 that he gave up was the one time he was matched up against DJ Moore in man coverage. 5 of the other 6 times he was matched up against Terrace Marshall. And Marshall is notable because Marshall, up until this past week, was a major disappointment for the Panthers. And the fact that he was able to get open as much as he did against Armstrong, again, give Armstrong credit for, playing through the whistle and breaking up those balls and showing those ball skills. But the fact that Marshall was able to get that much separation from Armstrong doesn't really paint a positive portrait of Armstrong. Although, again, to Armstrong's credit, some of those were back shoulder throws, so it wasn't as if he was completely out of phase or anything like that. So we'll see about that. We'll see if Alford gets more of a run this week against the Chargers. He only played 17 snaps against the Panthers. I'm assuming that's because he was still working back from that hamstring injury. And as we saw with AJ Terrell, you don't want to rush these guys back in that regard. 14 out of all 17 Alford snaps came in the slot. But I'm assuming that he'll be another option on the outside moving forward. But as I said, I do think we'll probably still see this quartet, some combination of this quartet, Alford, Armstrong, Hall, and Oliver, moving in the short term. And obviously, again, I haven't dive deep in the film on Fenton. What I have seen of Fenton this year seems to suggest that he's struggling. I watched Devontae Adams cook him a couple of times in that week 5 game against the Raiders. And then ever since then, he's been out with a hamstring injury. And from what I understand, earlier in the season when the Chiefs played the Chargers, Mike Williams, got the better of him on a couple of those plays as well. But other than that, like, the book on Rashad Fenton was that prior to this season, when he became a full-time starter for the Chiefs, prior to the season when he was kind of a spot starter for them, he had been played pretty good. Was mostly reserve in those years, primarily as a number 3 or number 4 corner in those years. I know towards the end of the season, he got replaced after starting the beginning of the season, or during the middle of the season, as an outside corner. He got replaced by Mike Hughes down the stretch. I don't know the exact reason. Was that poor play, or just the Chiefs thought Hughes was a better option for them? But I do know that at least a number of Chiefs beat writers and people that cover that team were certainly, prior to this year, at least, just going through like their past tweets, were big fans of Rashad Fenton prior to that. He was one of those guys that was like really severely underrated by a number of Chiefs fans. So that could lead to this move being like a sneaky good move, that if basically the pre-2021 version of Rashad Fenton shows up and the Falcons only gave up a 7th round pick for him, we could be looking at this move as, oh man, Terry Fontenot is a genius for making this move. But if he basically continues to play poorly like he seemingly has in 2021, then it's just kind of, again, you're still kind of lukewarm on it. Now, for Dean Marlowe, we saw a lot of Dean Marlowe this past Sunday against Carolina, replacing an injured Jalen Hawkins, and it was a rough day, right? Obviously, the signature play was he got beat on that touchdown at the end of the game, on that Hail Mary, whatever you want to call it, to DJ Moore. As Mike Rothstein broke down on yesterday's episode, Marlowe was much more worried about Moore making a play towards the sideline than going towards the end zone. And so I get why he played that play the way that he played it, but he simply got beat on that play, and there's really no excuse for that. So in addition to that play, he also, based off of my charting, blew a coverage on the opening drive where PJ Walker rolled out and missed the open Tommy Tremble. That would have been a significant game if Walker had made a better throw, and that was on Marlowe. You also had a face mask penalty on the opening drive as well. Then on the next series, there was another throw to DJ Moore's direction, and Marlowe fell down, but thankfully the throw was off target. And then he missed the tackle after Isaiah Oliver missed the initial tackle on that 39-yard crosser to Terrace Marshall in the fourth quarter that helped set up the go-ahead score where Carolina went up 28-24 in the closing minutes of that game. So overall, it was a very bad day for Dean Marlowe. It's no surprise that he was PFF's lowest graded player for the Falcons this past Sunday. And, you know, I'm sure that was a contributing factor to why the Falcons decided, you know, he's kind of expendable and we can move on. The Bills are looking for safety depth, from what I understand, because of an injury to either Poyer or Hyde. So now my boy Eric Harris is going to be their top safety backup. So should there be future injuries to Hawkins and Grant, Harris will be the one to step in. And again, based off of what we saw from Eric Harris last year, not so much this year against the Rams, but compared to what we saw against Dean Marlowe, you know, I do feel like that's a potential upgrade for the Falcons. And we may also see one of these corners get some longer looks and dabble as a safety. We've heard previous reports that the Falcons were thinking about doing that with Isaiah Oliver. I know Javonte Moffitt is on the practice squad. He did get elevated for the Carolina game as a replacement with Hawkins out, but only played on special teams. So he'll be an option as that fourth safety, but I imagine we'll probably have Sundays, particularly once Terrell and Fenton are healthy and playing. We'll have Sundays where you will see 6 active corners and only 3 safeties, which means that if the Falcons do need a fourth safety, it will probably be one of these cornerbacks, and presumably that will be Isaiah Oliver. So we'll see if, you know, the Falcons mix in some dime looks and have one of their corners be a safety in those situations, or some other sort of version of that. So again, I'll try to watch some Fenton tape moving forward, and we'll see how he fits into that in the future. And maybe I'll be loving this move a couple of days from now. But that's what we'll leave it. And we'll wrap up today's episode talking about what has been surprisingly good for the Falcons, answering a listener question there, and go through some stats that show how much growth the offensive line has made this year. But before we get there, guys, I want to tell you about Prize Picks, a fun new way to play daily fantasy. Just pick 2 to 5 players, and if they score more or less than their Prize Picks projection, you can win up to 10 times your money on your entry. It takes less than a minute to enter, and the great thing about Prize Picks is it's not you versus the people, it's you versus the projections. They offer projections on all the sports you want to watch: NFL, NBA, NHL, PGA, college football, and more. Prize Picks is safe, it's fast, it's easy, and it's currently in operation in over 30 states in the US and Canada. All you got to do is download the Prize Picks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up. And first-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with the promo code Locked On. That means if you deposit $100, you get $100 in money to play with. Don't forget to use that promo code Locked On at sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. Okay, guys, and as we wrap up today's episode, I do want to remind you, if you're looking for this great local content here on Locked On Falcons, as well as other Locked On Sports Atlanta podcasts, you can download the Locked On Sports Atlanta app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. Again, Locked On Sports Atlanta app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV, 24/7 local coverage. And for free, why not? So go check that out if you can. All right, so we'll wrap up today's episode talking about the thing that I thought was going to be what we initially talked about, because again, I did not expect the Falcons to be active at the trade deadline. So pretty much all the other topics I want to discuss on this All 22, including an extensive breakdown of the All 22, is basically getting punted. So I apologize. We won't be doing a deep dive into the film from today. I'll probably post clips to Dean Marlowe getting cooked on Twitter. I guess those were the plays I talked about. So we'll see. Maybe I'll put some stuff out about the Falcons running game a little bit later, but we'll get into that. So sorry for everybody that basically submitted questions that wanted me to get into certain things. Maybe we'll get into some of those things. Maybe we can circle back on Friday, but all that stuff is basically getting punted. But the meat of today's episode was initially going to be from a Discord question from Oso de Chocolate, who says, okay, we are halfway through the season. What is something that has impressed you about this team and something that has disappointed you? Expectations for the rest of the season. So what has impressed me has been their run blocking and the improvement of the offensive line. What has disappointed me is that they have not made significant strides in coverage this year. And my expectations for the rest of the season is that this team will continue to be competitive each and every week, and at least for the next 5 or so games should win the majority of those games. Whether they go 5-0, 4-1, 3-2 remains to be seen, or worse. But those are my expectations. And then we'll get to the bye week, and then we'll have real conversations about like what they need to do, in those final 4 games of the season, how many games they need to win in order to, make the playoffs and all that stuff. So we'll sort of, that will be our kind of checkpoint. Like, how many games can they win between now and the bye? And then we'll reassess. So those are my kind of expectations at this point in time. But circling back to the offensive line, which we'll take a deeper look into, going back during the summer, as you guys well know, I was not particularly high on the Falcons. And a big reason for that was because, like, when we look at Marcus Mariota midway through the season, and he's been trending up over the last 4 games compared to the first 4 games, but Mariota, for the most part, has been what I kind of expected him to be, which is kind of a league average quarterback. You look at his adjusted net yards per attempt, it's 6.25 through 8 games. The league average this year is about 6.0. It was 6.1 last year. So he's technically slightly above average from a passing efficiency number, but roughly league average. And part of the reason why I was so down on the team was because that to me was not going to be good enough. That was basically, Matt Ryan was a slightly below average quarterback last year when you looked at his Anya. And like we saw that without a really, really strong running game, that wasn't going to lead to a lot of success. And when I thought about the Falcons running game improving, I thought it would be better this year, but not by a huge degree when they were like a bottom 5 rushing attack. I thought maybe their ceiling was like 18, 20 range, maybe. If maybe like you had a couple of games where Cordero Patterson just went off for like 180 yards because he broke a bunch of long runs or something like that. But more than likely, you would see this running game ranked in like the 20s somewhere. And right now, when you look at like Football Outsiders, which I pay a little bit more attention to than just the raw yards, where I think raw yards are like 4th or 5th, but Football Outsiders has them 10th in DVOA. They have them 11th in adjusted line yards, which measures, basically is doing its best to try to give credit to the offensive line for how many yards that they're getting per carry. They're 12th in short yardage success after being dead last year. And they're 2nd in the amount of stuffed runs. And that stuff means how many like negative runs. So that means you're the 2nd lowest in terms of generating negative runs. And they're doing all this despite the fact that they've been running against heavier boxes pretty consistently week in and week out. If you look at next gen stats, Caleb Huntley and Tyler Algier have had 8+ defenders in the box on 36.2% of their runs this year. That is based off the GPS data. And if you compare that to Derrick Henry, who's number 2 in the league, has run against 8-man boxes on 36.1%. So basically combined, Huntley and Algier from that standpoint are basically being treated by defenses like teams treat Derrick Henry. And then if you take Mariota out of the data, the Falcons rushing success rate this year is about 54% on 213 carries. And if you just cherry picked the 8 best games from last year and looked at their success rate, they had a success rate of about 52% on 177 carries. So, you know, and the reality is Tyler Algier is kind of bringing this year's numbers down because Caleb Huntley's and Patterson's combined success rate this year is about 63% and Huntley's is 43%. So that's what brings it down lower. Now I don't know these exact figures because my go-to site in the past for getting these numbers was Sharp Football Stats, and they haven't updated since last year. But looking at Football Outsiders, they do have some shotgun stats for the Falcons. The Falcons rank 11th this year in usage of shotgun, and they were 27th last year. So they have leaned into the shotgun in large part due to Mariota, which isn't a surprise. You know, them leaning into it maybe more than I expected, but I figured they would dial that up a little bit more with Mariota under center. What's notable is last year when they did utilize shotgun, they were 28th in the league in DVOA out of shotgun, and this year they're 9th. Right now, Football Outsiders doesn't have the run versus pass breakdown, but part of me wonders, and one of the things I noticed against Carolina, and maybe I might put together a clip of this for on Twitter and post in the comments, but the Falcons ran a lot more out of shotgun against Carolina than they, at least I only look back at the Cincinnati game, but seemingly in the previous weeks prior to that. 21 out of their 31 runs from non-quarterbacks against Carolina, so roughly 2/3, were out of the shotgun. And you compare that against the Bengals, it was 9 out of 23, so, you know, a little more than a third the previous week. And I think that may benefit the Falcons simply because if they can play shotgun, particularly out of 11 personnel, and dial back the 12 personnel usage moving forward, that should theoretically soften boxes because typically teams will play nickel against 11 personnel and often only put 6 guys in the box. And what will be interesting about that is the running game out of the shotgun, at least again, only looking at the last 2 games, like Caleb Huntley seems to be a lot more effective running out of shotgun than Algier has been, right? Last week, Huntley had an 82% success rate against Carolina on 11 runs out of shotgun. Algier's was 33% against Carolina, and Huntley only had 1 run against Cincinnati out of shotgun. Wasn't successful on it, but Algier's success rate out of shotgun on 7 carries against Cincinnati was only 14%. So he was only successful on 1 out of his 7 carries. And it'll be interesting to see if the Falcons, if they do start running a lot more out of shotgun, will that lead to increased usage of Caleb Huntley moving forward? And we've talked about this before, where the reason why Algier gets more snaps than Huntley is because the Falcons trust Algier to hold up more in the passing game, both as a pass catcher and in pass protection. Only about 28% of Huntley's snaps this year have come on passing downs, while that's 48% for Algier, 46% for Patterson in comparison. So what has been notable is that basically that data is telling you that whenever Huntley's on the field, overwhelmingly the defense knows the Falcons are going to run the football. And even despite that, the fact that he's been as successful and as efficient as he has been this year is pretty incredible. And again, a testament to the blocking up front. So we'll see if that continues to moving forward. Now it'll be a new wrinkle that the Falcons can add that can help evolve their offense. When we talk about, you know, expectations for the rest of the season, that may be one way that the Falcons can evolve between now and the end of the season. So we'll keep an eye on that information. I'll probably go back and look at some of those numbers. But for those of you that have missed it, when we talk about the offensive line and the blocking up front, you know, I know a lot of people like to attribute Marcus Mariota's presence to the increased running and to the increased effectiveness of the running game. And while I think Mariota is particularly with the read option out of the shotgun stuff is certainly, a newfound element to the running game, he isn't influencing the running game, I think, in the positive way to the degree that I think a lot of people assume, particularly like on the rollouts and the stretch zone stuff. Like we know from past with, Michael Vick and the wide zone stuff that we ran then, that backside defender would have to sort of stay at home on those types of plays rather than, pursuing on the running back on the backside, and that would open up cutback lanes for the running back under Vic, and that was a big part of why that rushing attack was so successful. You aren't really seeing that very often this year with the Falcons, and you notice that like when you see those, like you're not seeing a lot of the Falcons' successful runs on cutbacks, right? Where it goes left and then the guy cuts back. There's a sprinkling of those types of runs, but most of their runs are just basically, they run left and they get to the outside, or they run right and they get to the outside, more so than these sort of cutback lanes. So I say that to give the offensive line that the bulk of the improvement from the running game is due to the blocking, right? And we touched upon this on the previous Q&A a couple of weeks back. To me, Dahlman and Wilkinson have been upgrades over Hennessy and Mayfield this year as run blockers. Matthews to me was a massive liability last year as a run blocker, and this year he's been solid. McGarry and Lindstrom have been, excellent this year as run blockers. And as I mentioned before, I attribute this not only to the players, but I also attribute this to the improved coaching and tremendous coaching that seemingly Dwayne Ledford, the offensive line coach, has done this season to get these guys to step up in a major way. I mean, like, simple fact is that, the Falcons on runs behind the left tackle this year in adjusted line yards are 8th. Last year they were dead last, right? And so that's a testament to how much better Matthews and Wilkinson have been in conjunction this year than Matthews and Mayfield were a year ago. And I think Ledford deserves a lot of that credit, and the coaching deserves a lot of that credit. So that is it, guys. We ran out of time today to get into more of your questions. I apologize again. Maybe we'll circle back to some of those later in the week, but there's a good chance that a lot of those are going to get punted. What I was going to say about the coverage that I won't be able to go deep on is that this year the coverage has been worse, but based off of my charting, pretty much across the board, whether you look at the linebackers, the safeties, the corners, it's been worse from each position group and overall for the defense this year, particularly when you measure by success rate. The only unit that has been better this year is the nickel cornerbacks, specifically in man coverage, that their success rate is actually lower this year through 8 games. And I'm comparing this to the first 8 games last year, not the entire season. So comparatively speaking, and that is mostly owed to the fact that last year, Isaiah Oliver was really good in man coverage, but his replacements were pretty terrible for that initial chunk when they replaced him. And this year, like Alford and Ford, when they were sitting in for Oliver in the first 5 games, were significantly better. They're actually pretty good based off of my charting in those games. So that's the only area that has gotten improved. Again, maybe we'll revisit this topic in the future when we get the opportunity and talk about some of the issues of why that is and some of the differences moving forward. But unfortunately, blame Terry Fontenot for being too active at the trade deadline. That has led to us not taking a deeper look into that on today's episode. Although, if you do want me to get into it, I could get into it on Saturday in the Discord, because we do these symposiums, which are basically Twitter spaces. So that will be another opportunity for me to answer some of these questions that I wasn't able to get into. And all you have to do is just show up. We schedule it for 3 p.m. Eastern time on Saturdays. So just sign up for the Discord and you'll be able to go there. So that will be another way I can make it up to you guys if you want to check us out. So the link to the Discord is in the description below, and that is going to do it for us here, guys. Really appreciate you guys submitting your questions, even though they did not get answered. And really appreciate Terry Fontenot for throwing a curveball. by making some trades, unexpected trades at the deadline. And so that will do it for us, guys. Check out Locked On Sports Today, Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Braves, Locked On Hawks, Locked On Bulldogs, in addition to Locked On Falcons, free and available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Till then, guys.